The morning of July 4th, 1847, dawned like any other in the sugar plantations of northern Florida, where the Suwannee River winds through cypress swamps thick as molasses. But by sunset, 10 overseers would be dead, their bodies floating face down in black water, and a legend would be born from blood and bayou mud. The man they called Ezekiel, though that wasn't the name his mother whispered to him in the Yoruba tongue, had spent 3 years planning this day of reckoning. While white families across the county prepared to celebrate their independence with fireworks and feasting, he prepared to deliver his own brand of freedom to those who had stolen it from him, and countless others. Ezekiel was no ordinary field hand. Behind eyes that had learned to show nothing but submission burned the accumulated fury of 1,000 broken promises, 100 lash marks, and 10 souls sold away from him like cattle. He was 32 years old, built like a cypress root, gnarled, strong, and impossible to break. His hands, scarred from cotton bolls and sugar cane, held secrets. He knew which plants could heal and which could kill. He knew how long a man could hold his breath underwater. Most importantly, he knew that demons dressed as gentlemen could drown just like any other creature when the swamp called their name. Before we continue with this tale of buried justice, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Stories like this need to be remembered. The Magnolia Grove plantation sprawled across 3,000 acres of fertile river bottom, its white columned mansion rising from manicured gardens like a monument to stolen labor. On this Independence Day morning, Master Charles Whitmore and his family prepared for their annual celebration, the kind of elaborate affair that would make Charleston's shoe-ras. Society green with envy. Crystal glasses caught the early light as house slaves, silent as ghosts in their pressed uniforms, arranged imported delicacies on tables that could have fed 50 field hands for a month. The contrast was as sharp as a blade drawn across tender flesh. Beyond the mansion's gleaming windows, where the scent of jasmine and fresh bread danced on warm air, lay the quarters, rows of weathered cabins that housed nearly 200 souls who would never taste freedom's sweetness. The morning sounds told 2 different stories. Laughter and clinking silver from the big house, muffled coughing and whispered prayers from cabins where families huddled on straw mattresses, their bodies already aching from work that would begin before the sun finished rising. In the swampland that bordered the plantation's eastern edge, something else stirred in the pre-dawn darkness. The cypress trees, ancient sentinels draped in Spanish moss like funeral shrouds, seemed to lean inward as if listening. Alligator eyes reflected starlight from black water that held secrets older than memory. Even the mockingbirds fell silent, as though nature itself sensed that this day would be different, that the blood-soaked earth was finally ready to collect what it was owed. The air hung thick and heavy, pregnant with more than just summer humidity. It carried the weight of accumulated suffering, of mothers who had sung lullabies to babies they'd never see again, of fathers who had watched their sons disappear into the maw of the auction block. Today, that weight would shift. Today, the swamp would have company. Ezekiel's story began not in Florida's fevered heat, but in the cool hills of Virginia, where he was born to a woman named Asha, who remembered the old ways. She had been captured as a child from what the white men called the Gold Coast, but she carried Africa in her blood like a secret river. Before the yellow fever took her when Ezekiel was 12, she taught him things that couldn't be beaten out of him. Which roots could cure a fever, which leaves could stop a man's heart, how to read the signs that water and wind wrote in their ancient languages. His father was a blacksmith, a giant of a man whose hands could shape iron into tools or weapons with equal skill. From him, Ezekiel learned precision, patience, and the understanding that every tool had a purpose, including the human tools that white men believed they owned. When the gambling debts grew too heavy and Master Morrison began selling off his property, Ezekiel watched his father disappear down a dusty road in chains, sold to a cotton plantation in Alabama. The boy's last memory of the man was the way his shoulders stayed straight, even as the shackles bit into his wrists. At 15, Ezekiel was sold himself, passed from one master to another like a piece of furniture that had grown inconvenient. Each sale hardened something inside him. Each new plantation added another layer to the armor he built around his heart. He learned to make his face a mask, to show only what would keep the whip away from his back. But behind that mask he watched, he listened. He remembered every cruelty, every broken promise, every time they called themselves Christian while dealing in human souls. It was at his third plantation, a rice farm in South Carolina, where he met Sarah. She was 16, with skin like polished mahogany and a laugh that could make even the overseer pause in his cruelty. For 2 years they carved out moments of tenderness in a world designed to crush such things. They whispered promises under starlight, planned a future they both knew was impossible, and for a brief time, Ezekiel remembered what it meant to hope. Then came the morning when he woke to find her gone, sold to a sugar plantation in Louisiana to settle a poker debt. The master's wife, a woman who fancied herself pious, told him it was God's will, that earthly attachments were sinful for his kind. That night, Ezekiel stood in the empty cabin they had shared and felt something die inside him, not his capacity for love, but his capacity for forgiveness. When the slave trader Cornelius Whitmore bought him 2 years later, transporting him to the Florida plantation that bore the family name, Ezekiel carried with him a new understanding. These people were not human in any way that mattered. They were demons who had learned to walk upright, to quote scripture while wielding whips, to speak of civilization while building it on the backs of the brutalized. And demons, his grandmother had always said, could only be fought with their own weapons. The Magnolia Grove plantation operated under the iron fist of 10 overseers, each more vicious than the last. At the top of this hierarchy of cruelty stood Thomas Brennan, a red-faced Irishman who had earned his position through enthusiastic application of the lash. Brennan believed that slaves were animals to be broken, and he took particular pleasure in breaking the ones who showed intelligence or pride. He had a habit of whistling hymns while he worked the whip, as if inflicting pain was a form of worship. His lieutenant was Jonas Miller, a thin man with pale eyes who specialized in psychological torment. Miller would promise extra rations or easier work in exchange for information about escape plans or secret meetings, then use that information to orchestrate punishment that left the entire quarters paranoid and divided. He delighted in forcing children to watch their parents receive lashes, believing that fear learned early lasted longest. For 3 years, Ezekiel studied these men the way a hunter studies prey. He learned their routines, their weaknesses, their fears. Brennan, for all his bluster, couldn't swim, a fact Ezekiel discovered when he watched the man nearly drown after falling drunk from a ferry. Miller was terrified of snakes, jumping at the sight of even harmless ribbon snakes sunning themselves on the dock. Each overseer carried similar vulnerabilities, and Ezekiel cataloged them all with the patience of a scholar and the purpose of an executioner. The plan crystallized slowly, like sugar boiling down to syrup. It would happen during the Independence Day celebration, when the overseers would be drunk on their master's leftover whiskey and careless with their usual vigilance. The swamp that bordered the plantation's eastern fields would be their graveyard. That black water had swallowed countless secrets over the years, and it would gladly take 10 more. Ezekiel began gathering what he needed: lengths of rope accidentally dropped by supply wagons, tools that went missing from the blacksmith shop, only to reappear in careful hiding places, and most importantly, plants. His grandmother's knowledge served him well as he collected water hemlock from the marsh edges, its innocent white flowers hiding deadly alkaloids. Oleander bloomed in the master's garden, its beautiful pink petals containing enough poison to stop a grown man's heart. He dried these, carefully ground them to powder when the moon was dark, and stored them in hollow reeds sealed with beeswax. The testing came gradually, a pinch of powder in the slop bucket of a pig that had been marked for slaughter anyway. The animal died within hours, confirming potency. A bit more experimentation taught him dosages, timing, how long it took various preparations to work their deadly magic. He practiced on rats first, then larger animals, always careful to make their deaths look natural, always learning, always refining his methods. But poison alone wouldn't be enough. Some of these men would need to die by his hands directly, and for that, he needed to be strong, fast, and utterly silent. In the pre-dawn hours when even the night watch dozed, Ezekiel trained his body like a weapon. He practiced moving through swamp water without making a sound, learned to hold his breath for impossible lengths of time, developed the grip strength to crush a windpipe or snap a neck with swift efficiency. As Independence Day approached, he began leaving small signs for the other slaves. A particular arrangement of stones near the well, a pattern of scratches on a fence post, signals that something was coming. Not everyone needed to know the details, but everyone needed to understand that when the time came, they should stay in their quarters, keep their children close, and let the swamp claim what it was owed. July 4th, 1847, dawned blood-red through the Spanish moss, as if the very sky knew what was coming. The celebration at the big house began early, with Master Whitmore's guests arriving in carriages that kicked up clouds of dust along the oak-lined drive. By noon, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted across the fields, where slaves bent over sugarcane under the brutal Florida sun, their sweat mixing with soil that had drunk the blood and tears of their people for decades. Thomas Brennan made his rounds that afternoon with the lazy confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. He carried his usual implements, a coiled whip at his belt, a pistol in a leather holster, and the casual cruelty that had made him wealthy in human misery. What he didn't carry was any awareness that today would be different, that the quiet field hand who nodded respectfully as he passed had spent 3 years planning his death with the precision of a clockmaker. As twilight painted the sky purple and gold, the overseers gathered at their usual spot near the boat landing, sharing a bottle of the master's finest bourbon while they discussed the day's business. The dock extended 30 feet into dark water where cypress roots created a maze of shadows, perfect hiding places for creatures that knew how to wait. Ezekiel moved through the swamp like liquid shadow, his body painted with mud that made him nearly invisible in the gathering darkness. Years of practice had taught him to navigate by touch and instinct, to slide through water without creating ripples, to breathe so quietly that even the night birds didn't register his presence. He was no longer entirely human in these moments. He had become something elemental, a force of nature seeking balance in a world thrown catastrophically out of alignment. The first to die was Henry Walsh, the youngest overseer, barely 20. Tied to and eager to prove his brutality to his elders, he had wandered away from the group to relieve himself in the bushes, humming a drinking song under his breath. Ezekiel rose from the black water like a resurrection in reverse, his hands finding Walsh's throat before the young man could draw breath to scream. The death was swift, a sharp twist that severed the spinal cord, dropping Walsh into the mud with nothing more than a soft thud that could have been a falling branch. One by one they fell. Jonas Miller next, lured away from the group by the sound of what he thought was an escaping slave crashing through the underbrush. Instead, he found Ezekiel waiting with a length of rope that became a garrote in hands that had learned their deadly work from necessity and rage. Miller's pale eyes bulged as his life leaked away, his last sight the implacable face of a man he had never bothered to see as human. The poisoned ones died more slowly, but no less certainly. Ezekiel had prepared their whiskey earlier, slipping ground oleander into the bottle with the patience of a man who had waited 3 years and could wait a few hours more. Samuel Dorsey was the first to feel it, a sudden tightness in his chest, a fluttering in his heart that grew into violent palpitations. By the time Thomas Brennan realized something was wrong, 3 of his men were already convulsing in the dirt, their bodies rejecting the concentrated death that flowed through their veins like liquid judgment. Brennan tried to run, his Irish accent thick with terror as he shouted for help that would never come. But the swamp had arms that night, and those arms belonged to a man who had learned to hate with surgical precision. Ezekiel caught him at the water's edge, where the dock met the bank, and looked into the overseer's eyes for a long moment before speaking the first words he had ever addressed directly to the man who had scarred his back with countless lashes. "My name," he said quietly, "is Olumide. It means, my God has come. Today, you meet him." Then the black water closed over Thomas Brennan's head, and the swamp claimed its final offering of the night. Dawn found the plantation in chaos. Master Whitmore's celebration curdled into horror as the bodies were discovered one by one, some floating face down in the cypress shallows, others twisted in final agony on the dock where the poisoned whiskey had done its work. 10 men, dead in a single night, and only one suspect among nearly 200 slaves who all claimed to have been asleep in their quarters when the devil came calling. But Ezekiel didn't run. When the sheriff and his deputies arrived with their bloodhounds and their questions, they found him sitting calmly outside his cabin, whittling a piece of cypress wood into the shape of a small boat. His clothes were clean, his hands steady, his eyes holding nothing but the same patient submission they had always shown. Yet something in his stillness made even the most hardened lawmen uncomfortable, as if they were looking at a force of nature that had temporarily taken human shape. The trial, such as it was, took place in the Suwannee County Courthouse 3 weeks later. White men in fine suits argued over the fate of a man they refused to acknowledge as their equal, while Ezekiel sat in shackles that seemed somehow insufficient to contain what he had become. The evidence was circumstantial. No witnesses, no murder weapons, only the undeniable fact that 10 overseers were dead and someone had to pay. When asked to speak in his own defense, Ezekiel rose slowly, his chains rattling like wind chimes in a graveyard breeze. His voice, when it came, was steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom. "You ask me to defend myself," he said, "against charges of killing men who bought and sold humans, beings like livestock, who raped our women and whipped our children for sport, who called themselves civilized while building their wealth on stolen labor and broken families. I ask you this: who taught me that killing was acceptable? Who showed me that some lives matter less than others? Who demonstrated that violence is the language of power?" He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the white faces in the gallery, faces that reflected discomfort, anger, and a dawning recognition of uncomfortable truths. "They taught me how," he continued, his voice never rising above conversational level but somehow filling the entire room. "Every lash of the whip taught me. Every child sold away from its mother taught me. Every woman brutalized in the name of property rights taught me. I am your creation, gentlemen. I am what you made me." The judge sentenced him to death, of course. There had never been any doubt about the outcome. The only surprise was how long he had been allowed to speak. But as they led him back to his cell, Ezekiel carried himself with the dignity of a man who had completed his life's work, who had balanced scales that had been weighted against his people for generations. On August 15, 1847, they hanged Olumide. They never did learn his true name. From a live oak tree on the courthouse square, a crowd of nearly 1,000 gathered to watch, expecting to see a broken man beg for mercy or curse his fate. Instead, they witnessed something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Ezekiel walked to the gallows with his head high, his back straight despite the chains, his eyes fixed on something beyond the horizon that none of them could see. When they asked if he had any last words, he smiled, the first time any of them had ever seen expression cross his features. "I go now to join my ancestors," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd. "But I leave something behind, in every shadow, in every whisper behind closed doors, in every moment when you wonder if your slaves are truly as content as you pretend. There I will be. Fear taught me to kill, but death will teach me to haunt." The rope snapped his neck cleanly, but the legend was just beginning. Within weeks, stories began circulating through slave quarters across the South. Whispered tales of the man who had drowned 10 demons in Florida's black water, who had shown that even the most powerless could become powerful when pushed beyond endurance. Plantation owners noticed changes in their slaves after the story spread. A new wariness in previously docile workers, a reluctance to meet their eyes that felt different from the old submission. Some reported strange dreams of dark water and reaching hands, nightmares that left them checking locks and posting extra guards. The name Ezekiel became a whispered prayer in slave quarters and a source of unease in plantation houses, a reminder that oppression always carries the seeds of its own destruction. In the swamps of northern Florida, where cypress trees still stand sentinel over black water, locals claim you can sometimes see lights moving through the mist on summer nights, 10 pale flames dancing above the surface like souls seeking redemption they will never find. The old folks say that's the overseers, still trying to escape the judgment that claimed them on that long-ago Independence Day. But sometimes they say, when the moon is dark and the water is still, you might glimpse another light, steady and strong and golden, moving purposefully through the maze of roots and shadows. That's Ezekiel, keeping watch, making sure the guilty don't rest easy in their watery graves. He has become what he always was in truth. A hand of the ancestors, a whisper behind the stove, a reminder that no evil goes unanswered forever. The blood that built this nation runs deeper than we care to remember. In every sugar crystal, in every cotton thread, in every brick of every mansion built by stolen labor, there are ghosts demanding acknowledgement. What violence is buried under our prosperity? Whose cries became seasoning for our comfort? Whose dreams were sold to purchase our ease? Ezekiel's story reminds us that resistance takes many forms, that the human spirit cannot be permanently crushed, and that justice, true justice, operates on timescales longer than individual lives. His legacy lives not in the violence he committed, but in the courage he showed, the dignity he maintained, and the truth he forced his oppressors to confront, that no system built on cruelty can stand forever. In the end, the swamp remembers everything. The water holds all secrets, all debts, all acts of courage and cowardice alike. And in its dark embrace, the voices of the forgotten continue to speak, continue to demand that their stories be told, continue to insist that their pain be acknowledged and their resistance be remembered. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. It really helps the channel keep bringing real stories that never make it into the history books. Because these voices deserve to be heard, these lives deserve to be remembered, and these truths deserve to live on long after the swamp has claimed us all.